So let's turn now to strengths in data. Any questions about what digital trace data is, why we're excited about it, and so on and so forth? Yeah. Maria.
I guess just a definitional question. So digital trace data, that's the first time I've ever necessarily heard that term. So I'm curious as to where big data, big social data is talked about in that way.
Sure, I'm glad you used the term big data, because this is our best way of not using the term big data. We wanted to be a little more precise in saying that this is more, another term that's often used for this type of data is found data. So it's data that's quote unquote naturally occurring out on the internet or elsewhere. And for good definitions, you can check out chapter 3 of your book, Matt, or chapter 2, and then Michael Macy, who we heard from last night, has an interesting piece in the annual review of sociology. It gives an overview of the kind of state of the art of the field. I think it's called Digital Footprints. I think that's 2014. But more broadly, it's just one struggle we all have here is our shared vernacular. And I think the critical distinction here we're making is that it's data that was created by someone else that can be repurposed for social science analysis. So that's a pretty broad definition. Good question. Other questions?
Can I ask a follow-up?
Of course, yeah.
So is the idea then to get away from using that big sort of umbrella term, big data, and trying to just be not only just more precise, but also, I guess, more exclusive in a way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think maybe this is a good segue to talk about strengths, because I think we all focus on that first aspect, right? Big, this is another chart from Matt's book, just making the very simple but important point that we have a lot more data. And that's an obvious strength for a field, social science, which has historically been data poor. We're used to dealing with data sets that have less than 1,000 observations. And as we saw last night, we can easily get up to hundreds of millions of observations. And hypothetically, and I think this is where Duncan gets a lot of his excitement about the field, we have population level data to a certain degree. If we think about Twitter as a population, that's very unusual. There's very important reasons why the size of data are important. I think, though, as I begin to see the new work come online as a reviewer, I'm increasingly impressed by the number of studies that, though they might draw from a very big data set, the ultimate analysis is on a couple thousand cases. And so I don't think the field isn't intrinsically about the size of the data. There's also this really interesting property that Bit by Bit notes in chapter 2 that it's always on. So in contrast to a survey where we have to write a grant, wait for the decision, maybe revise the grant, resubmit it, get our survey instrument into the field, or do our qualitative interviews, and come back and months later actually begin analyzing the data. There's an inherent problem in that line of research, which is that many of the most important events and social theories we want to test involve spontaneous events like Tahrir Square here, or any number of other events. And the nice thing about digital trace data is it's always on, so we can be monitoring these things. Now, there's some important exceptions that we'll talk about. So I've already talked to a few of you who have either worked with Twitter data or expressed the interest in working with historical Twitter data. And as you'll know, that data is not always available unless you have a large amount of money to pay to Twitter, or what was formerly GNIP, the service that archives that data. There's also data access issues with Facebook and many other sites. But in principle, especially if we're clever about using new event monitoring technologies that have been developed by a variety of social scientists, we have this interesting opportunity to observe events as they unfold. And that's a really important and unusual, something that takes us beyond the size aspect. The third big strength is that these data are non-reactive in principle. Not always, but found data, digital trace data, typically they are made without any intervention from social scientist or a researcher. And so we can capture, like we see here, behavior that people might not want to be observed. Now there are a variety of cases. Here we're looking at interest in self-induced abortion. This is from the Stevens-Davidowitz work, looking at Google AdWords data by state. Google AdWords, which estimates the average monthly search volume of a certain phrase. Here we're seeing searches for phrases like home abortion methods, and the analysis, kind of crude as it is, shows a rough correlation between the frequency of searches for home abortion methods and more restrictive abortion laws. And we have a number of other cases that many folks are interested in studying, things like overtly racist, subtle racism, or other socially undesirable behavior that we think we can pick up with digital trace data. So it's big, it's always on, it's non-reactive. I added a fourth one to Matt's typology, which is that it captures social relationships. And to the extent that a lot of social theory is about social relationships, Michael Macy last night made a big point about the problems with individual-centric analysis and how that abstracts from society as we actually experience it, and how that can lead us to various forms of measurement error. The nice thing about certain types of found data and digital trace data is that they capture some underlying social relationships. So here we have the European Parliament and the network ties between parliamentarians. There are very important questions to ask about what a network tie means in this context. A politician following another politician is a public act. It doesn't necessarily mean they're having dinner together, and so on and so forth. But the alternative and the traditional method of collecting data on social relationships is extremely expensive and logistically very difficult. Right? We'd have to either ask someone, name your 5 closest discussion partners, find them, ask their authors, and so on and so forth, using respondent-driven sampling or a similar method, or what's called a name generator method. And all of these techniques are both expensive, and some of them, as some of Matt's other work is documented, introduce some new types of bias. But the cost benefit here, I think a lot of us are hoping, is that capturing social relationships opens a lot of new lines of inquiry around things like the structural properties of social positions, things like how these peripheral nodes in the network that Macy showed last night may help us reimagine how we're all connected to each other, might explain things like the flow of economic advantages across entire communities, and so on and so forth. And also new opportunities to run experiments on social relationships. I think that's a really interesting opportunity. That's not so much about digital trace data, but the fact that we can observe how social relationships may or may not change after an observation is a really interesting new thing about this data. Okay, so most of that is probably not new to you. You're here because many of you are here because you're excited about these data. As we kind of bottom out on the trough, is it called the trough of despair? The trough of despair here, we're really getting hammered with a lot of important criticism that if we're going to succeed, particularly if we're going to succeed in publishing in top social science journals, we need to have answers to all these important criticisms, and I'll talk about some new ways I think we can do that. The first is that the data are incomplete. Now, there's a lot of ways they're incomplete. One way is that, let's say we're doing a study of Facebook comments. Facebook comments can be removed, and let's say we were doing a study of racist comments, and half of the most racist comments were removed either by the user themselves or by Facebook. That's another genre of error we'll talk about in just a second. But we're looking at an incomplete incomplete set of digital traces. It's also incomplete in that typically social scientists want to know not only what people are saying or who they're saying it to, but who that person is. We want to know their gender, their income, their class, their race. Why do we care about all these things? And this is, I think, important for the computer scientists in the room. There's a genre of computational social science which just kind of ignores all the attributes of people. And I think it's led, in my view, to some of the bottoming out of the trough of despair. You know, if the exemplars aren't great, if they don't address these issues like who people are who are producing messages on the internet, right? We're going to be caricaturized. We're going to be dismissed as people who are doing kind of unserious work that, you know, though it might be impressive in its scale, it doesn't really get us further in understanding how individual attributes are related to the processes we're observing online, or more importantly, how those individual attributes might shape some of those behaviors. Inaccessible. So much of the data we would love to analyze is inaccessible for a variety of reasons. Here we're looking at Facebook's current privacy settings that determine what type of data we can get access to through the API. This has changed, by the way. It's become, the default settings have come to share more and more information, as many of you will know. But, you know, if we are out to study, say, the type of social networks that Michael Macy was talking about last night, the relationships in terms of patterns of cultural consumption and how those might map onto politics, well, unless someone has made their profile public, we can't get that data. And so much of the work with digital trace data on Facebook right now is confined to public pages, things like fan pages. There are, I think, many interesting questions that can be asked about, for example, public deliberation, how things rise to prominence in public debate, and so on and so forth. But given that most people's default settings are not to share their data, we know that we're missing an enormous amount of activity on Facebook, which may shape the public activity in turn. Now, there's a variety of ways of yeah, Ethan, sorry.
Yeah, just I've heard of a discussion here and there about trying to incentivize like survey respondents or really anybody in a study to provide, like, download their data and then send it.
Yeah.
What's the status of that? I don't know.
Yes, yeah, great question. So are any surveys giving incentives to survey respondents to share their data?
Sure.
I just had a conversation with the PIs of the American National Election Study last week and discovered that they have in fact done that in the last wave. Unfortunately, due to a data transmission error, only 200 of the 600 cases they tried to get were collected. And I think it remains to be determined whether those will be shared publicly or through some kind of restricted access where you have to apply through your local IRB to access the data. The person to email would be, I think, Joshua Tucker. Is that the name right? NYU Politics. I believe he was the point person on that data collection effort. And there are others. I'm going to talk. One of the advantages about building apps for social science research, for example, is there's an opportunity to create an incentive for a user. I'm getting way ahead of myself, but that's another model. We're starting to see also research with Twitter that uses a similar model where you ask for permission to ask for the data. The other alternative, of course, is to collaborate with industry. That has obvious challenges. There's tremendous inequality in who has access to industry. We've seen a number of impressive papers that use very large samples with non-public data to produce some really exciting results. The voter experiment by Fowler, the various papers by Lada Adamek, Eitan Bakshi, and Solomon Messing, Cameron Marlowe. Most of these folks are members of Facebook's core, either are or were members of Facebook's core data science team, and they can ask these wonderful questions, but that data typically is not made available to the rest of us. There's very good reasons for that. One is protecting the privacy of Facebook's users. Two is the potential legal quagmires associated with that process. And third, various issues related to public relations. Facebook is a business. It shares its research. I think it would argue with the goal of improving public knowledge, and many other companies don't share their data. That's potentially a public good. But the other challenge is, of course, insatiable demand for research and Facebook's limited capacity to take on all subjects that would be of interest to all the people in this room. And so most people who wind up successfully collaborating with industry have learned to navigate the legal issues, the data protection issues, which usually means going to one of the campuses of an industry partner or having a graduate student, if those of you who are faculty members, go to the campus, and also finding a topic that satisfies one of the needs of your industry partner, and that's pretty hard to do. And we could have a long, interesting conversation about whether that pulls our science towards the needs of industry, and what consequences that has. But to sum up, so much of the data we would love to get our hands on is inaccessible, and that's a major weakness. I want to just pause to encourage participation. If you have individual experiences with any of these issues or solutions, please jump right in. One of the things we're really excited about is we know that there's knowledge in this room that both Matt and I don't have, and we want that to come out. We really proactively encourage that. So, anybody want to share in a experience with inaccessible data? Yeah, Hiro.
Actually, I worked in a private company, and at the moment I found meeting data. That means each employer have to make an appointment to use a meeting room. So that is an incredibly great data source to create social networks in the industry. So I found this very interesting interaction dynamics in the industry, but I couldn't use the data to publish a paper because I couldn't find the person in charge, because I see that data is valuable, but nobody thinks about this data is valuable. So there's no person who have a responsible for the record of the meeting data. So
Right.
it's hard to.
Great example. Yeah. So what did you do did you try to approach the company and you didn't get a response?
I tried to, for example, talk about my boss and also the HR and other like legal department, blah blah blah. But nobody, I don't know.
And I've heard this story time and again that people just don't know the answer. And if you think about it from industry standpoint, the cost benefit calculus is there's a lot of costs. There's potential legal issues, there's the PR issues, there's just the time issue. One of the interesting things I've learned in talking to folks in industry is just how difficult it is to sometimes find the data point that you're looking for. It requires collaborating with a systems architect and someone who has much deeper knowledge of the source code of an amazingly complex platform like Facebook to find out where you might put your intervention if you want to do an experiment or extract some historical data. And of course, some of the data is being destroyed on a timely basis. So there's a variety, a whole new genre of problems. Jeff.
Yeah, I have another, I guess, anecdote, and I don't know what to do about it, which is that, I guess for one of my projects I was working on like historical record linkage, so like census data, essentially you can think of it, but then it turns out that like the two big record linkage places are, the Census Bureau and then places like genealogical companies, so Ancestry.com, these types of, and it turns out that like if you look at all the papers, right, they have these amazing charts showing like, what is it called, like precision recall graphs and all this stuff, but they don't even release like a tiny snippet so that you could like replicate it or test your own record, record linkages with their stuff. So I just wonder, like, I feel like as like referees or something of journals, like you should say like, well, if we publish this, you should have some way that people can verify your results.
Right.
Because it's like with private companies, I just find it weird that like I'll read a paper and I'll be really excited about their method, and then I won't be able to find any data to test it on. So.
Right. Yeah, great point. Yeah, Matt.
So can I say, there's an example of authors who dealt with this problem really well. There's the paper by Ansel Bahare and Hirsch, who are political scientists. And they get data from a company that creates voting record databases and merges in all kinds of extra information. And they deal with this exact problem that they don't really get to observe how the company does all this data cleaning and merging. And they don't get to observe how the company does the record linkage. But yet they still develop several ways of trying to assess the quality of it without actually having to see the proprietary information. So as an example of the possibility, I think it's a great paper.
What is Ansel? Yeah, I know that guy. Who's the other author?
Hirsch?
Hirsch, okay. Thanks.
Could we share that on Slack too? I want to encourage everybody. There was a comment in the feedback last night that people want a list of emails to contact people. Slack, if you haven't used, is a really great way. It's a collective resource. We can quickly share that paper. A few of us were sharing stuff yesterday afternoon. It's a great way to get up to speed really quick. Any other experiences with inaccessible data? Data you would like to get, but don't know how to get? Oh, okay. It's one of the bigger problems here. Okay, another big problem, these data are non-representative. This harkens back to the earlier point about the data being incomplete. We often can't even determine whether our data is representative. So here are some, reasonable data, I think, from the Pew Research Center. Just looking at basic demographics, here race, across a few different platforms. So down here we have the entire internet, which we see is in the US is heavily populated by white non-Hispanics. But then we see this interesting variance across platforms, right? More African Americans are using Instagram and Twitter than Facebook and LinkedIn. And what's the upshot of all this? Well, again, given that representativeness, coverage, external validity is a core concern of pretty much every social science discipline represented here. If we do a study of, say, African American networks on Twitter and Facebook, right? We might wind up with much different conclusions. It might be there might be age or gender or geographic components that shape all of these platforms, and this is a big problem for us, and I think a really important reason that a lot of the new work is getting knocked. One kind of trick of the trade I want to share with you all here is, if you come out in a paper guns a-blazing saying that your Twitter data is going to allow you to, for the first time, do X, right? And you don't acknowledge any of the weaknesses of this Twitter data, you will just get lambasted in reviews, because you really, I think that the most successful papers that we're seeing coming online, they take one of two tracks. One is adding a lot of caveats, and of course that's important in any kind of careful research. The other is a new line of inquiry which says Twitter is because of its increasing relevance to the world, is worthy of theory in itself, and limiting your claims to Twitter itself. So essentially, instead of saying I'm explaining race and networks by looking at Twitter, say something like I'm looking at racial dynamics on Twitter. This is important because it's used more by racial minorities than other platforms, or something like that. That's another way I think we could have a much longer conversation about framing your work. One of the challenges we face reviewers who have a set of expectations which were shaped by conventional methodological training, and their impulse is to use that toolkit to criticize us. Now, often that's very reasonable, and in many of the cases I just described, that's totally reasonable. But one challenge is just the somewhat small pool of reviewers who actually understand the limitations and strengths of the data. Anybody want to share an experience about a friend who had trouble with this type of issue? Sorry, I saw a hand over here. Was it Ian? Jeff, yeah.
Yeah, so there's like a whole book called Arresting Citizenship that I know would be of interest of some people I talk to who work on like mass incarceration, and it essentially talks about, it goes through a lot of the data sets that are used in social science, I mean mostly political science, but like the election survey and general social survey and these types of things, and points out how like basically because what it does is it surveys people like in like incarcerated individuals, but it also has like an appendix where it goes through a lot of the you know, surveys that are used in social science a lot and talks about the populations that it doesn't include. So I feel like I just want to like photocopy that appendix and have it. So if you see that book, just look
that
at
would
the
be
appendix,
great.
and it has like it talks about like, oh, if you want to include, you know, incarcerated individuals, like this survey turns out that they do talk to people. This survey doesn't, and has like a whole table.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, a real contribution here would be just some very, you know, somewhat low-hanging fruit, and it might not get published in a top journal, but just a very solid analysis of this type of demographic bias of each data set. There's the Pew data. I haven't seen many other convincing. It might be an interesting group project to try to lay a groundwork. It could become a seminal citation if everybody. Now, this does take us to, is this the next issue or not? Yeah, that is the next issue. Great. Drifting, right? So let's say we make that data set and we do conclude that Twitter and Instagram have more African American users. What if not only the platform itself, what if the users of the platform, their behavior on the platform changes, right? You know, would anybody want to do a study of MySpace right now? Right? Even a historical study of MySpace, right? Let's say we were looking at some, trying to make basic arguments about how social networks form, right? During the life cycle of MySpace, we'd be observing profoundly different dynamics that are a product of its rapidly expanding and contracting user base. And so this is what Matt, I think, is usually labeled drifting in bit by bit. You know, we're seeing platforms and data from these platforms mean different things over time. And by the way, this probably isn't just a problem with social media data. This is probably an issue with various archival data too, to the extent that, for example, the census might change the way it measures things or cover more or less people over time, right? This is a kind of a core challenge.
Excuse me.
Yeah, of course.
Go back.
Yes, please. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
If you have the population on Facebook who is close or match the population at the census, does that mean that the population on Facebook become representative? I don't think so.
Let me turn around and ask that question to the group. So the question is, to what extent, if we find that Facebook approximates the U.S. general population, can we then think of it as a representative sample? No, Charlotte. Why do you think no?
I mean, I think there's probably a fundamental difference between people who use Twitter and people who don't use Twitter. So even if it's representative demographically, it might not be representative on a host of other factors.
Great. Yeah. Now, I mean, in fairness, when we do our stratifying for a lot of surveys, we're not looking at some of those attributes that might make survey respondents different. One thing I want to highlight, I think because of this hype cycle, because expectations were sky high, you know, the data had to walk on water often to be published, and so that was never reasonable, right? So I think part of the challenge here is is that some of the concerns we're seeing from reviewers, and I see, of course, other people's reviews when I review, and one thing that's really frustrating to me is when I see this type of work held to a standard that I think other more conventional work might not be held to. So is it a representative sample? It depends what we mean by that. We could have long conversation and get into the weeds with stats and sampling, and I think Matt we will on Thursday when we talk about Thursday, right? Non-probability.
Yeah, but not the weeds, the beautiful flowers.
The beautiful flowers, right? Not the toilet, the bike seat. So yeah, but great question. You know, and I think you know, there's a lot of these are open questions. You know, one of the challenges in writing up your work, I think, is that we don't have exemplars where we can say, so-and-so you said this is representative data, so now I'm going to treat it as representative, right? So we're still hashing that out. I don't personally believe there's a good answer. Yeah, Kevin, yeah.
As far as representativeness, like I work a lot with Twitter, and I worry about bots.
Uh-huh.
Like, what's the strategy for identifying bots, removing them from your sample?
It's a great question. I mean, I think there's as many of you will know, there's an entire field of bot detection. Maybe you've checked this out a little bit. You know, I think this is a pretty substantial problem. You know, I've done some work with ISIS, and there's a question there about to what extent are the ISIS accounts automated. we can do things like look at whether their network structure maps onto more natural, like is their degree absurdly high, is their centrality absurdly low. We can do kind of outlier detection in that way. We can do some natural language processing to try to look at whether, the same Twitter account is using the exact same post day after day. But of course, many bots are getting sophisticated in their use of language. So even at that level, I don't think there's a great answer. Does anybody else have a experience with bot detection or solutions? Yeah, Abdullah, yeah.
I worked a bit on bot detection on Twitter in particular, and it's definitely an interesting area of research. Actually, there is now services that they call them bot as a service, spam as a service, and basically you can go there and say, you know what, I want to spam this idea to people who are in this geographical areas, and you can pay per bot, kind of adding.
Is this like the micro-workers platform?
Sorry?
Is this micro-workers? Or are you talking about a service? It sounds like you're talking about a service. I was just wondering.
A service where people actually own a lot of bot accounts.
Oh, I see.
They can purchase them for whoever pays them some fees. And actually, one of their interesting services, which makes it really hard to detect spam, is that you, as a legitimate normal user with regular network structure, with regular content, you can rent your account to these spam campaigns, and they pay you per tweet. So you have your own tweet, but then they would actually send one tweet through your Twitter account on this hashtag in order to add some spam to demolish some idea or something like that. And you can make money out of it, while at the same time you are growing your organic natural network. Like that. So it's kind of a complex problem.
This afternoon, I hope someone remembers to ask Gary this question. Gary has done a really interesting piece on censorship in China, and he wrestled with this issue in particular. He had a very interesting opportunity where, he was trying to look at fake accounts created, he and his team believe, by the Chinese government. And interestingly, there was a leak that occurred somewhere in the process of their research, and they were able to train a text classifier based on the leaked documents to try to determine which bot was, which account was a bot and which was not. So if you have some kind of ground truth, that's amazing, right? But most of us won't, I think. Most of us won't get that lucky in the field. And of course, there's many training data sets out there, and this is again a really vibrant line of research. But it's a great question, one I don't have a great solution to.
So I don't know, there's actually an API now. It's called Bot or Not by people in the University of Southern California.
Oh, that's great.
Where actually they have kind of a very cutting edge classifier for bots, or like a kind of probabilistic one that gives you the probability of an account being a bot, and you can actually use their API within your code to filter out some of the bot accounts.
That's great. Will you share that on Slack, please?
I would.
Thank you.
It's, I was just looking at that article. It's Bessie and Ferrara from USC.
Maddie, did you have your hand?
Something that I usually hear people speaking about non-representative is that at least social media data is also about self-presentation. So me sharing political links, it's not about sharing political links, it's also sharing political links to certain crowd of people, and that of course biases the results quite a lot.
Sure.
But this isn't usually something that's ever discussed in any article.
Yeah, I'll get to that. I have another slide where I was going to get to that very issue. And here we go.
From this one, representative depends on the research question, don't you, right?
Of course, yeah.
For example, even if you do the survey and you get some US representative, but the result doesn't apply to other countries, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think representative is kind of obscure for me. For example, if researchers want to study the behavior on the internet, these people, it's okay using as a representative, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. Yeah.
So if the researcher
representativeness is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
Well, we'll talk more formally about that.
Yeah, we're probably skipping ahead. Okay. We've got drifting, algorithmically confounded. Many of you will know about this already. One of our shining exemplars of digital trace data was the Google Flu data. These were the data that for a long time tracked remarkably well with CDC's estimates. And CDC is the Center for Disease Control, for those of you outside the country, is our nation's epidemiological outfit. and they do these regular surveys to gauge the prevalence of influenza. And so what we're seeing up here is, you probably can't, but if you're following along online, and by the way, the slides are all linked on the schedule from the main webpage, you'll see Google flu in the orange here, CDC estimates in the light blue, and then some lags, these different colors here. And this is from a paper by David Lazar and Gary King and another co-author, where they noted that Google estimates more than doubled the CDC estimates suddenly in mid-2012. What happened? What happened was blue team dynamics. That is, something about Google's own algorithm created essentially a false positive. In this case, people who were searching for phrases like, I have a sore throat, then saw ads for solutions to the flu, then clicked on those, then started Googling about the flu, even if they didn't have underlying flu symptoms. This created an uptick in searches that were thought to be proxies for the actual flu, and we see this dangerous case of algorithmic confounding. That is, something about the platform you're studying changing user behavior that you're then interpreting as a research finding when it may simply be a problem with the algorithm itself. Yeah.
Just to be clear, there's no chance that the Google flu data was actually more accurate than the CDC data, right?
I don't remember how they dealt with this in the paper. We should ask Gary. Okay. I mean, he'll be here today. Do you know? I don't know.
Yeah. So whenever you compare two measurements, it's not like the CDC measurement is perfect.
Sure.
But I think that the patterns, the way that Google Flu moved was in a way that they were able to link it back to changes in Google Flu. Also, there's a separate paper where Google Flu broke down during I think 2009 swine flu, where searching behavior changed. Now, you could argue that people's visits to the doctor changed during that time too. So again, I think it's a fair question to say, is the thing that we're comparing it to really the right thing? And Chris pointed out, it's not always fair to hold one thing to a different standard than the other. But I think in this particular case, the combination of evidence seems to suggest that it was a problem with the not updating the model to adjust for changes in searching behavior.
Any other experiences grappling with algorithmic confounding? Maria?
This isn't actually an experience.
Or questions?
The link is back for the slides.
Okay. Sorry. We'll fix that. Yeah. And you can find the title of this article is "The Parable of the Google Flu" by Lazar, Lazer.
Oh, just kidding.
Oh, is it working? Okay, good. Yeah, Maddie. Yeah.
So how about beyond algorithmics and thinking about the affordances of the system? For example, with Facebook likes, there was only one like style, so
right,
therefore it was found, like what we measured was confounded by the fact that Facebook
right.
only provided that kind of opportunity. And same for conversation threads, where there's been different kind of approaches for those.
Sure, yeah. And these raise these really interesting questions about, like, to what extent should we be studying the platform as it is, or using the platform to approximate some other underlying social process? And those are just really vexing questions that haven't been worked out. Yeah, it's a good point. Let me just say two more things about this issue. The reason I think it's particularly concerning is we often don't know. We often don't have the logic of say Facebook's friend recommending algorithm. If we're, for example, trying to study how social networks form, and one, we might not know, and two, that might be ever changing. So the recipe that goes into the algorithm Google used to measure influenza prevalence might change. By the way, it's my understanding, talking to David, the lead author of this paper, that this problem has actually been corrected very well by Google, and David was concerned that this paper created too much pessimism about the potential of Google search data, and that now he's really a strong proponent. So just for the rest of you, know that there is good news. It seems like, at least for this issue, there's been a pretty convincing fix. Now, for other issues, we need to keep an eye on it. Dirty. just really, really bad. I mean, the misnomer, I mean, I think many people who get into collecting digital trace data, you write your few lines of code, it pops into a spreadsheet, right? No, I mean, anybody who's done this knows that, you're dealing with all sorts of messy data formats. Messy meaning they have a complex structure. Messy meaning they might have, if you're dealing with a database, different numbers of cells, different numbers of rows, different numbers of elements within a list, right? Just really not the pristine, clean data that the caricature of computational social science often gives us. The other thing, I mean, often, though, digital trace data often gets described as a complete description of some social process. Often we just have a lot of missing data. And that can come from a problem in coding. So for example, we'll look soon at how to grab some comment data from Facebook's API. And if you are requesting more than 500 comments, you will only get up to 500 unless you effectively page through the API, meaning going through each part of the API. And so this type of data now, is that data dirty because of the researcher's process of data collection or because of the way Facebook makes it available? We could debate about that. But this type of problem, in addition to the many merging errors or other types of errors that might come up, on top of the kind of intrinsically dirty nature of the data, is a real challenge. As anybody, I could share a personal experience from actually two projects where a major finding was in peril based on the discovery of some dirty data or this type of coding error. And I would be surprised if those of you who've worked with this data haven't had a similar experience. One of the challenges, I think, we don't have anything planned on this, but I think just in part because of the size of the data, identifying the dirty elements is a challenge. Could be new opportunities for machine learning, missing data patterns, and so on and so forth. All right, sensitive. So we talked about a bunch of cases yesterday. This one was particularly concerning to me. This was about May of last year. Danish researchers scraped students. Yeah, students can be researchers too. Scraped a giant chunk of OkCupid and publicly released it on Twitter. Many of us were kind of begging them not to do this on Twitter because of the obvious negative consequences, right? The key underlying conditions, and Matt hinted at this yesterday from an IRB perspective, right? Much of this data is in the public domain, insofar as people who make, say, a comment on a Facebook fan page should know that it could eventually be viewed by someone else, and yet many people, maybe even a majority of people, don't know that. And so where does that leave us as researchers? Should we anonymize that data? Do we need to protect those people's comments? These are questions, in my experience, that represent a kind of gray area in IRB, and of course, we see large variance in IRBs across universities and internationally. And I think one of the really key issues about this particular case is that the legal infrastructure for protection of human subjects is just vastly different in Northern Europe than it is in the United States. So, we face this issue of, like, let's say we get all these data, and let's say we want to share these data, the earlier comment about how we, get around this reproducibility issue given the sensitive nature of the data. And also given that, in theory, we're supposed to be complying with the terms of service of any database we're using, these create real mazes, moral mazes for us as researchers. Also, just logistical challenges. There's a variety of cases where you might want to protect yourself from getting exposed to some data that you don't know exists. So, examples that come to mind are researchers studying, for example, suicide on Facebook who encounter this type of information. So the data is very sensitive. that's an intrinsic challenge. Anybody have a question, comment, experience with working with sensitive digital trace data? Yeah, Marie.
So I'm actually working with a Twitter data set that uses the why I stayed and why I left hashtags, which if you don't remember, the Eric Rice situation where he punched his then fiance in the elevator. It was like a big campaign on Twitter. So a colleague and I are working on that, and a lot of the considerations are around, a lot of folks that use that hashtag were sharing their personal stories around domestic violence, and so thinking about how to protect those stories, how to talk about those stories within, in terms of, DV research has a really hard time actually getting samples, obviously, because of...
Sorry, you said DV research?
Domestic violence.
Oh,
sorry.
okay, gotcha.
Thank you for...
No problem.
And so, yeah, so it's a very sensitive data set just because of the stories that are being talked about, whether people have actually left those relationships or not. Just, a lot of sort of ethical issues around protecting those people.
Sure. Great example, yeah. Any others? Okay, the last one, and this gets to Maddie's point, is that what people do and share on social media is obviously, in many cases, very selective. And this is a point that I'm just adding here to Matt's typology. There's a real risk of what you might call positivity bias. People aren't sharing bad news on Facebook, much less Twitter, right? There's different reputational dynamics associated with these different platforms. An interesting study might look at Snapchat and Twitter and Facebook and look at different dynamics in terms of how much positive or negative information is shared. There are some studies online already, I can share them on Slack later, that have documented this positivity bias. Not a surprising finding, I think, given that, we are, of course, most users are aware that they're being observed by others, but it does raise this question about to what extent is the behavior we're observing on social media, to what extent is it more of a public performance than an underlying measure of social reality? Yeah, Kevin, yeah.
One of the things that I did with that with Twitter is like looking at the different contexts, so like retweets versus mentions versus general tweets. And one of the things that I found is like retweets, everyone is universally more positive. They retweet. I was looking at physical activity, like all racial groups, all ages are universally more positive. But kind of the opposite of the positivity bias is what I found, I think, in relation to gender. I think that because I was looking at exercise, and I think that there's this element with exercise that like, I went to the gym, it sucked, it was terrible, but the key information is I went to the gym, right? So I think that there's this kind of signaling that where people are being negative, maybe more negative than they would on normal, but they're trying to tell you about the activity that they were a part of.
Right,
Humble brag.
Exactly.
Humble brag, yeah. Great example, yeah.
How do you model a humble brag?
Natural language processing doesn't get sarcasm and puns and humble brags.
Hard, yeah.
Yeah, Anjali.
This is a case where, because I study organizations, it's really hard to get at what's the true experience of employees in organizations, because often what firms will share about themselves is very much like this very positive stuff. And on the other hand, on a lot of websites where employees are encouraged to share the real truth, you'll get this selection towards the negative experiences. So where do you find the real, the sort of a full set of experiences of organizations?
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, like the pressure to conform on Facebook, I think, leads to a lot of problems in trying to make sense of the opinions that are expressed. I had a student who ran a project where she was in a sorority and she quizzed everyone on their.
Wait a minute! An undergrad wrote a paper about a sorority. I don't get it.
Right. Yeah.
Totally implausible.
Yeah. She quizzed her students. She quizzed her fellow sorority members about their political beliefs and who they were supporting during the 2016 campaign. And there was actually great variation. And then sort of ran a Facebook experiment to see who would actually either candidate. And by and large, supporters of one candidate who expressed over a private survey that they supported this one candidate were completely unwilling to do so on Facebook, right? In this way that it's a little different than positivity bias, but it's hard to make sense. It just seems to me that you're actually what you're actually studying is more localized, right? You're studying opinion on Facebook.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or
Yeah. So that's a great example. I think also just to Maddie's earlier point too, it's not even necessarily just positive stuff. It's just certain types of stuff, right? Like in the case Maddie was giving, that many people, I think Twitter is a good example. You have people who say, "Here's what I ate for breakfast," and then you have people who are purely there for some professional association, and they're, and if we're treating both of them as snippets of the population, we're picking up a ton of noise.
But more in terms of, has there been actually any work trying to address that kind of bias that's in the data, like properly address it, saying that okay, this is what we know that is bad. Anyone knows?
I can share 2 papers, but they're basically on positivity bias that I know of. Other people know of papers? Yeah, Anna.
One suggestion that I've seen people implement is combining that with qualitative data, having people sit down and look through their news feeds and give you context about the things that they're writing, so that you understand that the extent to which there is a difference in the particular subject area that you're looking into, so you can randomly sample a proportion of your participants.
Yeah, it's a great idea.